There was some nervous laughter. Someone suggested it might have been a satellite, a weather balloon, a military aircraft. Someone else joked that nobody back home was going to believe them. The conversation wound down, and eventually they turned in for the night. Jim lay awake longer than the others. Whatever he had seen, there was something about it that unsettled him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Not terror, exactly, but a low, persistent wrongness, like a note played slightly off-key. He told himself it was nothing. He almost believed it. Days 3 and 4 passed without incident. They paddled, fished, explored, and ate well. The wilderness worked its restorative magic. By the afternoon of the 4th day, they had settled into the comfortable, slightly timeless rhythm of people who have successfully escaped their ordinary lives. As dusk settled, they set up camp at a new site and built a large fire, the kind meant to last a night, stacked generously with thick logs that would burn long and hot. With the campfire blazing behind them, they decided to take the canoes out for some night fishing. The lake was calm, the temperature pleasant, and there was nothing more relaxing than floating in the darkness with a line in the water and nowhere particular to be. They paddled out a short distance from shore and let the canoes drift. The firelight flickered warmly on the bank behind them. Above, the stars were extraordinary, the same overwhelming canopy they marveled at on night 1. It was Chuck who felt it first. He couldn't have explained it precisely. Not a sound or a sight, but a feeling, the kind that raises every hair on your arm simultaneously and makes the back of your neck go cold. The feeling of being watched, observed with an attention that was focused and deliberate and not entirely human. Slowly, he turned and looked over his right shoulder. The object was back. It was nothing like the distant pinprick Jim had described from 2 nights before. This was enormous, a great sphere of light hanging in the sky above the trees, pulsing with an inner luminescence that reminded Chuck, absurdly, of a miniature sun. The light rolled across its surface in slow, hypnotic waves, brilliant enough to throw sharp shadows through the forest and turn the dark lake to something resembling daylight. It was vast, it was close, and it was utterly, impossibly silent. That silence was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Every aircraft humans have ever built announces itself with sound, the roar of engines, the thrum of rotors, the distant thunder of jets. Sound is inseparable from flight in the human imagination. Yet this object hung in the air above them without producing so much as a hum, a vibration, a whisper. Its silence was the silence of something operating by entirely different rules. All 4 men stared at it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The canoes rocked gently beneath them, and the great all floated above, and for a long, suspended moment it felt as though the entire universe had contracted to this single point, for small men in 2 small boats on a cold lake in Maine, and something enormous and ancient gazing down at them from above. Then Chuck did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He picked up his flashlight and aimed it at the object. Whether it was curiosity or instinct or some impulse too deep and strange to name, he began flashing the internationally recognized distress signal, SOS, ... He wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to communicate, or to whom. Some part of him simply needed to reach across the impossible distance between whatever that thing was and the fragile human being sitting in a canoe below it. The response was immediate. The orb moved. It shifted from its stationary position above the tree line and began tracking along the shoreline, moving directly toward them. It moved with a deliberate, unhurried confidence, not the speed of something startled into motion, but the measured approach of something in complete control of the situation. Charlie Foltz would later describe the exact moment his curiosity curdled into terror. When the light started coming towards us, he said, "My curiosity was satisfied. I just dropped the flashlight. The only thought in my mind was to get to shore. I never looked back." They paddled. They paddled with everything they had, arms burning, breath ragged, the canoes cutting through the dark water as fast as 4 panicked men could drive them. Behind them, above them, the light grew more intense, its radiance washing over their backs like the glare of something enormous bearing down. There was no question of outrunning it. Whatever this thing was, it moved with an effortless ease that made human muscle power feel pathetically inadequate. And yet somehow, they made it to shore. They stumbled out of the canoes onto the bank and looked up. The orb was directly above them, so close that, as Jim would later recall, you could have thrown a stone and hit it. Its light was blinding and total, reducing the world around them to a flat white void. The heat of it pressed down on their faces. It was real. It was physical. It was right there. Then, without warning, it was gone. Not gradually, not drifting away into the distance, but instantly, shooting upward into the night sky at a velocity that compressed the journey from directly overhead to indistinguishable from a star into approximately 2 seconds. One moment it was enormous and overwhelming. The next it was simply another point of light among millions, and if you hadn't known where to look, you never would have found it. The 4 men stood on the shore in the sudden darkness, breathing hard, and that's when the strangeness became truly strange. They should have been shaking. After an experience like that, heart-hammering, adrenaline-soaked, every survival instinct screaming, the body takes time to come down. They should have been talking over each other in urgent, overlapping voices, recounting every detail, unable to process what they'd just seen. They should have been afraid. Instead, they were calm. Not the calm of people who have rationalized a frightening experience and convinced themselves it was nothing. A deeper calm, almost pharmaceutical in its totality, smooth and heavy and unowned. The fear was simply gone, replaced by a placid, dreamlike tranquility that none of them could account for and all of them recognized, on some level, as deeply wrong. We understood, even in the moment, that we shouldn't feel this way, Jim would later say. We'd just seen something extraordinary, something terrifying, and yet there was no panic. None at all. We all knew it was wrong, and yet none of us could break through it. Then they noticed a fire. When they'd launched the canoes, they had left a large, carefully built fire burning on the bank. The kind of fire that, properly tended and fueled with thick logs, should have burned for hours. It was their beacon, their warmth, their anchor to camp. But now, as they stood on the shore in the aftermath of their encounter, the fire was nothing but cold ash. Not dying embers, not the last orange glow of coals. Dead ash, gray and cold, as though the fire had burned out hours ago. They looked at each other. None of them could remember paddling back to shore. They remembered the frantic sprint across the water, the light burning above them, the moment of standing on the bank and watching the orb dissipate. But the actual act of beaching the canoes, the moment of transition from water to land, was simply gone. A clean, surgical absence in their collective memory, as precise and deliberate as a cut made with a very sharp knife. We agreed we couldn't have been out on the water for more than 20 minutes, Jim said. But the fire was ash. Cold ash. Something had taken the time. What happened in those missing hours would remain a mystery for 12 years. That night, inexplicably exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the paddling or the adrenaline, all 4 men went to bed without extended discussion. There was no late-night processing session, no urgent comparison of experiences, no lying awake piecing together what they'd seen. They simply slept deeply, immediately, and without the restlessness that fear typically brings. In the morning, they packed up camp and continued down the river. They spent 10 more days in the Allagash Wilderness, as planned. They talked about the encounter often, turning it over and examining it from different angles, finding no satisfactory explanation that fit all the pieces. But they never saw the light again, and they never found the missing hours. Not yet. Back in Massachusetts, the 4 men told their story to anyone who would listen, which turned out to be fewer people than they'd hoped. These were artists, imaginative, creative, known among their friends for elaborate ideas and darkly playful humor. When they described a glowing orb in the Allagash Wilderness, people smiled and nodded with a particular expression reserved for people who might be putting you on. Their story dissolved into the ambient noise of social life, passed around occasionally as an interesting anecdote and never taken entirely seriously. Time moved on, as it does. The men graduated, launched careers, built families, and accumulated the ordinary architecture of adult life. The encounter of August 1976 became a story they told sometimes, over drinks, with a half-embarrassed air of people describing something they can't quite explain and don't entirely expect to be believed. As years passed, the memory of it softened and blurred to the edges of where all memories do, and there were moments when even the 4 of them found it difficult to fully credit their own experience. But Jim Wiener never forgot. He couldn't, because the nightmare started almost immediately after they returned home, and they never stopped. At first they came infrequently, once a month, Perhaps vivid and disturbing, but not disabling. Jim would wake in the small hours of the morning with his heart pounding, lying still in the dark and waiting for the images to fade. He didn't tell anyone about them. They seemed too strange, too personal, too difficult to explain without sounding unhinged. In the dreams, he and his 3 friends were in a room. A sterile, clinical space, cold and brightly lit, with smooth walls that didn't quite match any material he could name from waking life. All 4 men were there, Jack, Chuck, Charlie, and himself, stripped of their clothing and sitting on a bench along one wall. Jim himself was lying on a table, a device of some kind pressed across his chest holding him immobile, though not painfully. He couldn't move. He couldn't call out. He could only watch. And there were beings in the room with them. They were humanoid in the broadest sense, upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head at the top, but the proportions were wrong. They were too thin, attenuated and fragile-looking, with heads that seemed too large for their bodies and eyes that were too wide, too dark, containing no white at all. Their mouths were thin lines, barely there. They moved with an efficiency that suggested complete comfort and total authority in this space, this situation, this encounter. They were doing something to the men on the bench. And then they turned their attention to Jim on the table. He would wake from these dreams with a cry caught in his throat and a feeling of violation so acute and immediate that it took minutes to convince himself he was in his own bed, in his own home, in the ordinary world. The dreams left marks. They accumulated, and as the years passed, instead of fading as nightmares typically do, they grew more frequent and more vivid, as though something were pushing them forward from some deeper place, insisting on being acknowledged, refusing to be buried. By the mid-1980s, Jim was having them weekly. By 1987, they came nearly every night. He was exhausted. He was frightened. And he was carrying this alone, unwilling to burden his friends with something he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Then, in 1988, 12 years after the Allagash trip, he finally told his brother. Jack's response stopped him cold. "I've been having the same dreams," Jack said. "Exactly the same." With this revelation, the possibility they had all quietly feared and quietly pushed away could no longer be denied. The missing hours had contents. Something had happened in that gap. Something their waking minds had sealed away but that their sleeping minds kept returning to, driven by some need for resolution that transcended ordinary memory. Jim reached out to Raymond Fowler, a respected researcher and author based in Massachusetts who had spent decades investigating UFO encounters and abduction cases with careful, methodical approach. Fowler had written extensively on the subject and was known for his rigorous documentation and his refusal to sensationalize his findings. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person you would want guiding you through something like this. Fowler's recommendation was specific and deliberate. All 4 men should undergo hypnotic regression separately, without consultation beforehand, so that their accounts could be compared afterward without the risk of contamination. If their stories diverged significantly, that would tell them something. If they converged, if 4 men who had not communicated about their dreams produced consistent accounts of what had happened in the missing hours, that would tell them something else entirely. It took some persuasion to bring Chuck and Charlie into the process. Neither of them had experienced the recurring nightmares that had driven Jim and Jack to seek help. But something in both of them, some quiet discomfort that had never entirely resolved, said yes. There had always been a sense that the night on the lake was unfinished business, that they were carrying knowledge they didn't have full access to. They agreed. The sessions were conducted separately, each man placed under hypnosis by trained professionals and guided carefully through the events of August 1976. What emerged from those sessions was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. All 4 men described the same room, the same cold, clinical environment, the same bench, the same thin, large-headed beings moving through the space with practiced efficiency. All 4 described being subjected to some form of physical examination, their bodies measured, scraped, sampled in ways that left them feeling profoundly exposed and helpless. Jim, under hypnosis, was still angry. His voice shook with a barely contained fury as he described lying pinned to the examination table, watching beings approach him with instruments he didn't recognize. "I don't like these things," he said, his voice raw. "I don't care where they come from. They shouldn't be doing this to people." Jack described the beings communicating with him, not in words, not in any sound, but in some form of direct transmission that bypassed language entirely and arrived in his mind as complete thoughts. "They are saying things in my head," he said under hypnosis, his voice low and frightened. "Don't be afraid. Do what we say. Just do what we say." Charlie's account had a quality of dissociated precision that was somehow more disturbing than raw fear. "It's like a doctor's office," he said quietly. "Cold, like a doctor's office is cold. They put a panel over your chest. Then they scrape your arms and your chest and your legs." A pause. "We shouldn't be here. I just keep thinking, I want to be back in the canoe." Chuck, in his session, described watching Charlie on the examination table from across the room. He described a silvery device, curved and reflecting the cold light of the room, positioned above Charlie's head. "He looks like he's in pain," Chuck said, his voice breaking. "And all we can do is watch him. We can't help. We can't do anything at all." 4 separate accounts. 4 separate sessions. One story. When they compared notes afterward, the silence in the room was complete. With their art school training serving them in a way they could never have anticipated, all 4 men then drew detailed sketches of what they had seen: the room, the beings, the instruments. The drawings were strikingly similar, not identical in every detail, as the memories of any 4 people who experienced the same event would differ in minor ways, but fundamentally, structurally consistent in ways that were difficult to attribute to coincidence. They had agreed, reluctantly and with great difficulty, to submit to polygraph testing as well. All 4 were asked directly, had they fabricated the story? Had they coordinated their accounts? Was the Allagash encounter a hoax? All 4 said no. All 4 passed. The story broke into the national consciousness with remarkable speed. The 4 men appeared on the Joan Rivers show, their quiet, earnest accounts of what had happened in the wilderness cutting through the natural skepticism an audience might bring to such claims. Shortly after, the Allagash incident was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, one of the most watched programs in America, reaching millions of viewers who would carry the story with them for the rest of their lives. The elements were simply too compelling to ignore. For artists, for credible witnesses, a decade of vivid recurring nightmares, separately corroborated accounts obtained under hypnosis, consistent physical descriptions, detailed sketches drawn from memory, and clean polygraph results. Whatever you believed about UFOs and extraterrestrial life, this was not a case that dismissed easily. Skeptics, of course, had their arguments, and they were not without merit. The psychological community has long acknowledged that hypnotic regression is an imperfect tool, capable of surfacing genuine buried memories, but equally capable of generating false ones with complete emotional authenticity. The 12-year gap between the original incident and the hypnosis sessions provided ample time for the men's memories to be unconsciously shaped by a culture thoroughly saturated with images of alien abduction. The classic gray aliens, thin bodies, large heads, dark eyes, had become so embedded in popular imagination by the late 1980s that one could argue any 4 Americans asked to visualize extraterrestrials might produce similar descriptions. The financial motivation argument was raised as well. The men gained media exposure, book deals, and speaking engagements from their story. Recognition of that kind can be a powerful incentive. And then, in 2016, something happened that added yet another layer of unresolvable complexity to the case. Chuck Rack gave an interview in which he suggested, with carefully chosen words and notable reluctance to commit to a flat denial, that the story had been fabricated. He stopped short of calling it an outright hoax from beginning to end, but he implied strongly that the men had seen an opportunity and had allowed a genuine but mundane experience to grow into something larger than it was. He suggested they had believed, at certain points, that it could make them wealthy. "We were compelled to stay together," he said, "or speculating that this thing could go into the millions of dollars for each of us. We made very little." The other 3 men, Jim, Jack, and Charlie, responded with considerable bitterness. Charlie Foltz described Chuck as a man who had become increasingly volatile over the years, whose relationships within the UFO research community had soured dramatically, who had been asked to leave or was banned from certain events due to his behavior. He described Chuck as a loose cannon, unpredictable and capable of lashing out in ways that had damaged the friendships that had once defined all of their lives. The recantation, they argued, was not truth-telling but revenge, the act of a man who felt pushed out and isolated and who chose the most devastating form of retaliation available to him. Whether they are right about Chuck's motivations is impossible to know from the outside. What's clear is that by 2016, the 4 young men who had paddled into the Allagash Wilderness together in search of beauty and inspiration had arrived at very different places. 40 years had passed. The experience, real or constructed, remembered or manufactured, had shaped all their lives in ways none of them had anticipated or chosen. Here is what we can say with certainty about the Allagash Abduction. 4 men went into the Maine wilderness in 1976 and came out changed. Something happened on that lake on the 4th night of their trip. Something that produced a missing gap in the collective memory of 4 otherwise credible individuals. Something that generated 12 years of recurring nightmares detailed enough and consistent enough to disturb everyone who has examined them closely. Something that 4 separate hypnotic regression sessions would surface as a shared and internally coherent account. Whether that something was a genuine encounter with beings from elsewhere in the universe, a shared psychological event produced by stress and suggestion in the vast, disorienting darkness of the wilderness, or an elaborate creative collaboration that spiraled beyond anyone's control, that remains genuinely, stubbornly unknown. What the case illuminates, regardless of where you stand on the literal question of extraterrestrial life, is something important about the nature of memory itself. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, assembled fresh each time we access it, shaped by emotion and expectation and the stories we already believe about the world. The missing hours in the Allagash story are frightening not only because of what they might contain, but because they remind us that we are all, to some degree, at the mercy of what our minds choose to show us and what they choose to keep hidden. Jim Wiener spent 12 years carrying dreams he couldn't explain and being woken night after night by images that felt like memory rather than imagination. Whether those images were true in a literal sense or true in some other, stranger sense, the sense in which a dream can hold emotional truth even when its content is impossible, they were real to him. They cost him sleep and peace and, eventually, his sense of certainty about what had happened on the lake that August night. That is its own kind of haunting. So the next time you find yourself far from the city lights, lying on your back in the dark with the stars spread out above you like something spilled, look carefully. Enjoy the beauty of it. Marvel at the depth. But perhaps, just perhaps, linger a moment on any light that doesn't quite behave the way light should. Any brightness that hovers too steadily. Any silence that feels too complete. And if you ever find yourself in a dark lake with a flashlight and something enormous watching from above, consider very carefully whether you really need to signal back. Some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. Some silences, once broken, cannot be restored. 4 young men learned that lesson on an August night in Maine almost 50 years ago, and whether or not you believe a single word of what they experienced, the echo of it has never entirely faded. Some things, whatever they are, wherever they come from, are content to wait. Every town has a dark side, even the most beautiful ones. In the northernmost reaches of Maine, where civilization gradually surrenders to wilderness, there exists a landscape so pristine it feels almost otherworldly. Endless forests stretch toward horizons unmarked by power lines or city glow. Rivers carve through ancient rock with a kind of furious elegance, and lakes sit wide and still beneath skies so crowded with stars that first-time visitors often stop in their tracks and simply stare upward, momentarily forgetting who they are and where they came from. This is Allagash country, and for generations it has called to people seeking something they couldn't quite name: peace, maybe, or perspective. A reminder that the world is larger and older and stranger than the daily grind would have you believe. The Allagash Wilderness Waterway winds through approximately 92 miles of remote northern Maine, but it is a river itself, stretching 65 magnificent miles, that has always drawn the most devoted adventurers. Canoeing it is a rite of passage for those who love the outdoors with a genuine, bone-deep devotion. The water moves from gentle to ferocious and back again. Moose wade in the shallower stretches, dunking their enormous heads beneath the surface while black flies swarm above, waiting patiently for them to resurface. Eagles drift on thermals overhead. The forest breathes with a kind of slow, ancient rhythm that has a way of resetting something inside a person. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most beautiful places in America. It is also, as 4 young men would discover in the summer of 1976, a place where something profoundly unsettling can find you, even when you're sure you've left the rest of the world far behind. They met at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, tucked into the heart of Boston near Fenway Park in the great museums of Huntington Avenue. Art school has a way of drawing a particular kind of person, curious, imaginative, sensitive to beauty and strangeness in equal measure. Jack and Jim Wiener were brothers, bound by blood and a shared sense of wonder. Chuck Rack and Charlie Foltz completed the group, fellow artists who had become close friends over the course of their studies. By late August of 1976, all four were hungry for something the city couldn't provide. Boston is magnificent, but it is also relentless. The noise, the heat rising from the pavement, the constant press of human ambition, it wears on a person after a while. The four friends needed open air and open sky. They needed to remember why they become artists in the first place, because the world, when you really look at it, is astonishing. So they planned a 14-day trip to the Allagash Wilderness, long enough to genuinely unwind, long enough to find whatever creative inspiration the wilderness might offer, and perfectly timed before the fall semester drew them back to their studio desks and sketch picks. The drive north from Boston takes about 7 hours when you are headed deep into Maine's interior. The landscape transforms gradually, strip malls and suburbs giving way to small towns giving way to farmland giving way to forest that grows denser and taller with every passing mile, until finally the trees press close on both sides of the road, and the sky narrows to a ribbon overhead. By the time they reached Eagle Lake, one of 5 interconnected bodies of water accessible through a series of streams and waterways, the city felt like something from another lifetime. They rented canoes, loaded their gear, and pushed off into the water. Almost immediately, the tension they'd been carrying dissolved. The paddles dipped and rose in easy rhythm. The forest hummed with insect life. The air smelled of pine resin and cold water and something indefinably wild. Conversation came easily, then drifted away into comfortable silence. These were men who knew each other well enough to understand that sometimes the best company requires no words at all. That first night, they built a fire on the shore and ate dinner under a sky unlike anything Boston had to offer. Away from the light pollution of the city, the stars were simply overwhelming. Not a backdrop, but a presence, dense and brilliant and impossibly deep. The Milky Way arched overhead like a river of cold fire. All four men lay back and stared upward, and for a long while nobody said anything at all. It was the kind of moment you store carefully, the kind you return to in memory during harder times. Pure and uncomplicated. But the sky, as they would soon discover, was watching back. The second night out, Jim Wiener was sitting alone by the fire while the others drifted toward their sleeping bags. It was warm for late August, the air still and soft, and Jim was in no hurry to end the evening. He sat with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the embers pulse and listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythms. That's when he noticed it. At first it barely registered. Just another point of light among thousands, slightly brighter than the stars nearby, hovering just above the tree line on the far shore. But something about it snagged his attention and held it. He reached for his binoculars and brought them to his eyes. The object came into focus. It was luminous and still, neither moving toward him nor away, simply floating with an uncanny steadiness that no conventional aircraft could have managed. Jim watched it for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to be certain he wasn't imagining things, long enough to feel a slow, creeping unease begin to work its way up his spine. Then the light simply vanished. Not like a flame blown out, not like a light switched off. It collapsed inward from the edges, folding into itself and winking out of existence in a way that left Jim staring at the empty space it had occupied, his mind working to process what he'd just seen. He called out to the others. Groggy and skeptical, they emerged from their bags, and Jim pointed to the tree line. The object was gone, of course, but something in Jim's voice told them he wasn't joking. They stood for a while, staring at the sky, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't.